Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, hello and welcome to Afternoon Light Live at the Robert Menzies Institute. 80 years ago today, in 1944, Robert Menzies and others were gathered at the Masonic Hall in Canberra for a conference that would result in the formation of the Liberal Party of Australia. This unity conference brought together 18 different groups from around Australia. And while new political parties on the centre-right at that time were not uncommon, there'd been several since Federation: the Protectionists, the Free Traders, the Liberal Fusion, the Nationalists and the United Australia Party. What was different this time was that the Liberal Party continued. This political success, and it is the most successful political party in Australia's history, could be argued to be down to the art of politics that Robert Menzies displayed. But there were other aspects. Its philosophy that is so enduring, its federal structure, its organisation, its unity in autonomy. Now, joining me today in this special Afternoon Light Live edition is Robert Menzies Institute board member Dr. David Kemp. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And historian Dr. Zachary Gorman. Welcome, Zach.
It's good to be here.
And Zach has edited this new book, A Federal History of the Founding of the Liberal Party, Unity and Autonomy, with contributions from people like David Kemp. And it's released just today. We've just received these beautiful copies and it's available for sale on our website. And we're really looking forward to discussing this history on this very special day, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the founding of the Liberal Party. But before we get started with our discussion, to our audience members, please know that you will be able to submit questions via the Q&A function. David, so 80 years ago today, in fact 2 days earlier, the conference started in Canberra. What was happening in Canberra? Paint a picture.
Well, 80 years ago today, the 16th of October, was a Monday. It was a wet, cloudy day in Canberra, and the conference met for its final meeting on that day, on the morning, after a hard Sunday's work in committee, drafting up the key documents that would found the Liberal Party. In my view, the 16th of October is definitely the birth date of the Liberal Party. And it's that because all the organisations that were really in the shape of political parties, a fragmented residue of the United Australia Party, which Robert Menzies led, agreed that they would give up their independence and they would dissolve and join with one national political party. And that party would have a similar name. As it turned out, it didn't have an identical name in every state, but a similar name in every state of Australia. It would be centrally organised. It would have a central structure, a federal council. Menzies was particularly keen that it have a federal secretariat who would coordinate the various states, because up till then his side of politics just didn't have what he called a political general staff. And he was really the person who led all the delegates to that point. There were some organisations there that were not political parties in their own right. One of those was, in fact, an observer organisation that sent my father, along with a friend of his, Roland Mountain, to Canberra to be part of that unity conference. And my father always used to tell me that there was one moment that he never forgot at the unity conference. A lot of the delegates stayed at the Hotel Canberra, which is now the Hyatt, and they were walking through the lobby inside towards the interior of the hotel, and in the distance they saw Robert Menzies, who suddenly ducked behind one of the big pillars. And as they approached him, he poked his head out and, recognising their role as observers, said to them, "Seen anything suspicious, boys?" And it was a friendly gesture, because he did in fact quote some of their work in his concluding speech to the conference. But it was one of the remarkable things that happened, that The party was named on that day. Later, as the rain came down, Robert Menzies went out and addressed the press and said that a new Australia-wide party would be formed. It would be called the Liberal Party of Australia, and its main features would be determined in an organisational sense at a conference in December.
Wow. Well, a very important time. Your father was obviously there with the Victorian Institute of Public Affairs. Who are the other organisations that attended? Who are these 18 organisations? And I'm not going to ask you to list them all, just the top 3 or 4. It's fine.
Well, each of the states differed in the level of fragmentation that had followed the defeat of the UAP at the 1943 election. It was after that election that Menzies became once again the leader of the opposition, and it was his initiative which pushed the conference through. He wrote to these organisations, and they included parties in New South Wales that had broken away from the UAP, the Democratic Party and the Liberal Democratic Party in New South Wales. So the name UAP was almost vanishing in New South Wales. In Victoria, there'd always been a group of organisations, the Australian Women's National League, the Young Nationalists, the United Australia Organisation, which was the remainder of the UAP. In South Australia, of course, there was a Liberal and Country League that Thomas Playford had established. There was the People's Party in Queensland, and they, in fact, were not one of the organisations that attended, though they were invited to come. And so when Menzies first addressed the delegates on the Friday of that weekend, he gave what was a remarkable speech, setting out a narrative of how all those different groups could come together in unity to represent a common philosophy which he proposed to them, a set of policy objectives and principles which were embodied in the decisions of the Unity Conference, and establish an organisation that was Australia-wide, which none of the earlier organisations had had. If you look back in our history, you see that the early Liberal, Protectionist and Free Trade parties lasted about 8 years. The Liberal Party of Alfred Deakin and Joseph Cook lasted about 9 years. Into the 1920s, we had the Nationalist Party, which again lasted about 9 years, a bit longer than that, from 1917 to 1931, and the UAP lasted 13 years. And then, extraordinarily, a political party was established which has lasted 80 years. And its main character that Menzies foresaw for it is, I think, one of the main explanations as to why it's had that longevity.
Well, we'll get on to a discussion about the secret sauce, for want of a better expression, a bit later. But Zach, what was unique about 1944 that I guess led to this particular moment in time, and what was familiar, do you think?
I think that one of the things that the book really reveals is how much the Liberal Party is a product of World War II. And it's interesting that World War I had sort of been destructive of Australian liberalism. You did have that original fusion Liberal Party going into World War I. It was even in power going into World War I, and then Joseph Cook lost the 1914 election. But World War II, why it was so important to the founding of the Liberal Party was it created this unique political circumstance in which our politicians were, for a change, thinking about long-term, big-picture politics. There was this really deeply philosophical contemplation of the question, what sort of a nation is it that we are fighting for? And obviously the most famous of that contemplation is Menzies through his Forgotten People broadcast that he's able to make as a backbencher through 42, 43 and 44. But Menzies is not alone. What comes up in the chapters in the book is how many different Liberal figures, whether it be White in New South Wales, whether it be the Nationalist Party of Western Australia, are trying to formulate a philosophy that can really ground a political party on enduring principles, as opposed to United Australia Party, which had been founded basically on a single issue, beating the Depression. And then once it had achieved that goal, it didn't really have much to stand on. But what's familiar is that the 1943 federal election has so many resonances to what happened in 2022 as far as this fracturing of centre-right politics into a host of independent candidates. There were more candidates stand for seats in 1943 than had ever occurred at any of our federal elections up until that point. And there was even a Women for Canberra movement. There was this deliberate push to get more women elected to Parliament that has these strong similarities to the Teals. And then in the aftermath of the election wipeout, there was a referendum, and the centre-right had to decide, even though it was disheartened and sort of soul-searching, it had to decide whether or not it would oppose Curtin's proposal to introduce 14 new constitutional powers. A lot of the centre-right ended up backing yes, hedging their bets, thinking that's where the cultural zeitgeist was going. Billy Hughes, Percy Spender, both campaigned for yes, but Menzies campaigned for no, and that ended up being the springboard to the founding of the Liberal Party because it gave him so much political momentum.
And of course, not that she was part of the Women for Canberra push, but Dame Enid Lyons ends up being elected in the 43 election. So there was a woman in Canberra.
Yeah, there was
finally.
Yeah, there was two. And what's different is that the independents in the Women for Canberra movement never got up. The two women who got up had major party political
Yes, of course, Enid Lyons in the United Australia Party. David, there's often a lot of debate about why the name Liberal Party was chosen. It's got really historical roots in Australia, which is incredibly interesting. But can you explain your view of why the name Liberal Party was chosen and why it's important?
I think the name was chosen because Robert Menzies really foreshadowed it and favoured it. Once he'd become leader of the opposition, he extracted a condition that he would have carte blanche to try to establish an Australia-wide new party. And he felt that that party should represent not a national crisis that could be dealt with, but a long-term political philosophy or position. He said there were fascist parties, there were socialist parties, there were conservative parties. And what he thought was needed in Australia was a party that represented the liberal tradition. And he actually told his parliamentary colleagues at the end of 1943 that he thought the new party should be called the Liberal Democratic Party because it stood for liberal democracy. And that, of course, had tremendous resonance because Australians were beginning to get the feeling that the Labor government, while managing the war, was also putting in place many regulations which were controlling every aspect of life. And there was a lot of debate within the Labor Party about whether or not those wartime restrictions would be continued in peacetime. Menzies was aware of the fact that there was something of a liberal revival also beginning overseas. You had economists like Joseph Schumpeter talking about the future of capitalism. You had Friedrich von Hayek putting out The Road to Serfdom, in fact, in 1944. John Maynard Keynes had in many ways saved the liberal economy by showing that you didn't need incredibly radical social reconstruction to stop mass unemployment. What you needed was government that saw that it had a role in keeping demand high and using all the resources that were available in the country. So a lot of people were talking about liberalism and the need to revive liberalism. And when I read the speech that Menzies gave at the opening of that Unity conference, I'm always impressed by the sentence which says that he believed there was a desperate need in Australia to revive liberal thought. And liberal thought, in his view, and I think generally, was understood to mean policy that focused on the needs and wishes of the individual person. He said, we'll never get progress in this country through central authority by government regulation and government direction. What we need to do is to help each individual person to achieve their fullest capacity. And that's what motivates people. That's what creates enterprise. That's what creates innovation and creativity. And if we have a government which can set up a framework in which people can choose their work, decide what they're going to do, make their own decisions, make their own choices in life, then we will have progress. Without that kind of freedom, progress is not going to occur, and if progress doesn't occur, then security itself is only going to be a delusion.
It's interesting, David, the predecessors to the Liberal Party, the United Australia Party and the Nationalists had, as you and Zach were saying, been set up contemplating certain national and international emergencies, so the Great Depression and World War I. But is there an argument that the Liberal Party was set up as a post-war Reconstruction party and then it had to really evolve from that? Because, in 1944, they're contemplating winning the war and then what do we do after? What sort of Australia do we want to create? But once that's, I guess, run its course, how does that philosophy underpinning what Robert Menzies was speaking about and others like, Don Cleland from Western Australia, how does that guide the governance of the country with those liberal principles?
I think post-war Reconstruction was certainly on everybody's mind, and the government was certainly putting it front and centre and established with Herbert Coombs a Department of Post-War Reconstruction. But Menzies wasn't really thinking about post-war Reconstruction. He was thinking about Australians being faced with a choice between two completely different ways of governing Australia over the longer term, as Zach said. And one of those ways was the liberal way, which meant putting in place a legal framework for economic enterprise that encouraged economic enterprise, not one focused on public works, not one focused on directing people as to how they should live their lives, but a framework in which people would be encouraged to achieve what they could achieve. And his liberalism went beyond that. I mean, one of the interesting things about Menzies' liberalism, which has struck me in the course of doing this research and other research, is that Menzies was very interested in the social consequences of liberalism and achieving institutions in society which would protect people. And that included not just the rule of law and a parliament which was representative of people, but social attitudes in which people were regarded as being of equal human dignity. They weren't there to be directed by some central power which was growing all the time. Central power needed to be restrained, and the legal frameworks needed to respect the right of individual people to live their own lives. And that's to be seen in Menzies' attitudes to, as they developed in government after 1949 to Aboriginal Australia. He was talking even at the formation of the Liberal Party about the need for women to have a key role and to be consulted fully in government and to have a part in government and to get rid of discrimination against women, which I think is remarkable at that time. That all Australians he saw as being entitled to the same recognition and respect, and not a country and a culture, a political culture, which divided people into classes, or as we would now call, identity groups.
Thanks, David. Zach, you've brought together, I think, 12 authors, including yourself, to put together this federal history of the founding of the Liberal Party, unity and autonomy. What was, I guess, your premise in deciding to approach this history, this telling of this story in this way?
Well, yeah, the first thing to note is there have been some other histories of the Liberal Party's sort of origins. The two main books are Gerard Henderson's Menzies' Child and Ian Hancock's National and Permanent. Both of them are over 2 decades old at this point, so there's an extent to which they're dated just by the passage of time. But the main difference between them and what we're trying to achieve with this book is that they're very much a centralised narrative. They start with the founding and then they proceed to cover liberal history up until the point at which the authors were then writing. What this book tries to do is it tries to understand the Liberal Party as a pervasively federal entity, an entity that certainly when it was founded only existed very nominally at the federal or Commonwealth level. There was a federal secretariat and various centralised things, which is part of what the party's founders were trying to achieve, because the UAP had had so little of that. The UAP had basically not been a national organisation. It hadn't covered the board. But fundamentally, the way that Menzies and the founders of the Liberal Party were able to get everyone to buy into this premise of the Liberal Party was to give each of the state divisions as much of their own autonomy as possible. So they would be able to control how pre-selections were performed, control what their local constitutions would be like, control their policy making for state politics, accepting that there's sort of no one-size-fits-all solution to anything across nation and continent as vast as varied as Australia. So that's what we're trying to do, is understand how Australia was and remains this federal entity, this federal system where each of the states has their own sort of political culture. And you very much saw that as recently as the 2022 election. I mean, what Liberals have to appeal to in Queensland, in Victoria, are very different things because they're very different states. And there isn't enough acknowledgement of that when we're talking about Australian politics. We like to have a simplified, centralised narrative. But that's not how history is, and that's not how the reality is.
Yeah, well, exactly. We think of federal politics in the framing of Parliament House, Canberra. It is centralised, the people gathering together. But in fact, the politics that affects your day-to-day life is where you live, your community, and, ramps up from there. We've recorded a series of podcasts with almost all the contributors to this Unity and Autonomy book. And what struck me is how very different the political cultures are in all the states in the 1940s. Can you give a flavour of that, Zach?
Yeah, so say New South Wales, where I wrote the chapter on, New South Wales was basically the heart of the problem. New South Wales had the electoral wipeout.
Don't we know it?
in 1940 rather than 1943. By the time you had the Unity Conference, there were just 4 federal UAP MPs left from New South Wales, and only 2 of them turned up. Spender and Hughes were basically kicked out of the parliamentary UAP at that moment in time. So there was all sorts of dysfunction. The opposite would be, say, South Australia, where they got their house in order so well in the 1930s with the Liberal and Country League that they arrived as a pre-existing Liberal Party to the Unity Conference and even got to keep their own name. Menzies basically said, well, there's nothing going wrong in South Australia. You guys are doing a pretty good job. Keep it up. And then there's Queensland, who didn't turn up. There were some Queenslanders there at the Unity Conference, but the main centre-right political party in Queensland was the People's Party. That's not the Country Party, because, of course, Queensland has a very large country party, and that had been formed in 1943. And they said to Menzies, thanks, but no thanks, we can't come. Because one of the problems they were facing, the People's Party, was that they were led by a former Brisbane Lord Mayor in John Beales Chandler, and he was trying to break into Queensland politics and convince the rest of Queensland, particularly Northern Queensland, that his party wasn't just a party for Brisbane. So when he was already suspicious of being too far south in Brisbane, the last thing he wanted to do was associate with even more Southerners down in Canberra.
Well, yeah, he had a fair point there, although they ended up changing their mind in 1949. So it was a short-lived thing, resisting the temptations of the Southerners. David, before we open up to the audience Q&A, I do want your views on the secret sauce. Why has the Liberal Party, still existing to this day, outlived all its predecessors? And not just outlived, I mean completely, kicked it out of the park. It's incredible. It's 80 years. The others you were listing were sort of 9, 8, 10. This is an incredible achievement, but there must be something fundamental that was different about this that has led to that success.
I think there are several things. One is that Australian political culture is fundamentally a liberal culture, and that goes right back to colonial times, that people came to Australia seeking opportunities and they wanted to control their own lives. And any Liberal politician from the beginning of democracy in Australia in the mid-19th century right up to today who presents policies which increase the capacity of people to live the lives they want and to look after their families in the way that they want and to educate them in the way that they want, will find a resonance in the electorate. And I think Menzies understood that, and he knew that that Liberal tradition was very much imbued in the middle class, the forgotten people around Australia. The second thing is, of course, the national or perhaps we should use the word federal organisation that was put in place. None of the earlier organisations for the UAP or the Nationalist Party or the Deakin Cook Liberal Party, let alone the earlier parties, had a national structure. And the Unity Conference put in place a framework which went from local communities with local branches through state councils, through state executives, through a national federal executive and a federal secretariat, and established very clear rules for the relationship between the parliamentarians and the organisation. So that the structure that was put in place was one which was designed to last and designed to represent a very strong and continuing stream in Australian culture. And of course we see that with the emphases and in policies that the Liberal parties adopted successfully over the years. One has to put number one as the economic policies, the encouragement of enterprise, the encouragement of initiative and innovation in economic life. But you see it also in social policies, in choice in schools, in the right of bodies that are outside government to set up their own hospitals. The mixed system of public-private provision in Australia meets exactly the ideals and objectives that Menzies set out in 1944, that people, regardless of their background, should be able to access good education, and people, regardless of their wealth, should be able to get proper medical care. And the Liberal Party has been able to put into place policies which reflect the respect for people and the individual, which liberalism is focused on.
It does beg the question, though, David. The Liberal Party wins the 1949 election led by Robert Menzies, and then he retires at a time of his own choosing in 66, uninterrupted period of time in government, and then he has three successors in Harold Holt, John Gorton and Billy McMahon, and there's a consistent period of Liberal Party, country party rule till 1972. Could you argue that period, that extensive period of time in office, the Liberal Party really entrenched it then and gave it very solid foundations to be a long-lasting political party?
Well, I think it showed the validity of the decisions that were taken in 1944 to set up the party in the way that they did. But again, we mustn't forget the fact that Menzies saw as one of his great achievements the establishment of a political party with a philosophy. And that philosophy enabled the party to cope with some of the major issues that arise in a democratic country. And in a democracy, the main driving force of politics can probably be said to be self-interest. But self-interest is often selfish, and there's no guarantee that policies based on the self-interest of, say, the trade union movement or particular aspects of the business community or local groups of one kind or another are going to add up to a broader public interest that meets the shared interests of everybody. And Menzies' philosophy really directed the Liberal Party towards policies which reflected the shared interests of everybody and gave the arguments to the political leadership and members that would allow them to meet the demands of special interest groups which flock around all politicians and hone to a sort of general direction which was understood not only by the party but by the wider community. So I think this idea of the party having a philosophy has been accepted by the leadership of the party, not just in the three leaders that succeeded Menzies, but in fact Liberal leaders since as well. And you even today see Liberal editorials in the newspapers saying, well, what's the Liberal Party philosophy say about this? And let the Liberal leaders address this. And of course, that's a very fair thing to say because that is the real essence of what that political party stands for. It stands for a great political tradition that is deeply rooted in Australian society.
Thank you, David. Well, we are now in our audience Q&A time, and I have got a lot of questions already coming through. The first question we've got, and they don't seem to have an individual they're directed to, so I guess just indicate. Yes, I'll decide as I'm reading it out. Why were those on the centre-right prepared to support Robert Menzies as their leader a second time around? It's a good question. Zach, would you like to have a go?
Yeah, I would say that he had the clearest grasp of ideas. I was reading some newspaper articles from the Sydney Morning Herald the other day from the 1940s. And the Sydney Morning Herald was a scathing critic of Menzies in his first time as Prime Minister. New South Wales in general didn't particularly like Menzies in his first iteration as Prime Minister, hence them losing 5 coalition seats at the 1940 federal election, plunging Menzies into minority government. But even this sort of staunch critic of Menzies could admit by 1943, this is in the immediate aftermath of the election wipeout, and they're sort of talking about who should lead the UAP and rebuild the centre-right of politics. They said that he's got a uniquely philosophical approach. He really thinks about ideas that had already become clear through the Forgotten People speeches. And the other thing is that he had learnt lessons. We have a chapter all the way back in the Young Menzies, it seems like decades ago now, when we released that book, talking about how Menzies had this tremendous learning experience from his time in the leadership role and having to resign. And I don't think you could have had a political greenskin come into that role with so much fractiousness and be able to rebuild from the ground up. And I think it shows the maturity of Menzies that he rebuilt from the ground up in a centralised way. He wasn't interested in creating a minor party to challenge the UAP. He wanted to reform the whole of the Liberal and Conservative movement. And the fact that he had the chutzpah to have that goal and that he actually achieved it is simply remarkable.
Yeah, quite audacious. David, did you have anything more to add on that before we go to the next question?
Yes, I would just add that I think what Menzies showed remarkably, in addition to the points that Zach has very validly made, is extraordinary persistence. There was a great deal of moral courage in that man. And when he lost the Prime Ministership the first time, he did learn. And when he came back again through that period and became leader of the opposition again after the 1943 election, you saw something quite remarkable. We haven't seen anything quite like that until John Howard. And John Howard and Menzies stand side by side, and it is interesting that they are both the 2 longest serving Prime Ministers in Australian history.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, a shout out to Dr. Scott Prasser, who wrote that chapter on Menzies, the learning leader. We do have another question that really picks up on this theme about how Menzies reinvented himself after his fall of his government in World War II. I think we can consider that question largely answered unless you have any more insights on that. The next question I have is, do you think the modern Liberal Party has succeeded in the idea of inclusion of women and minorities that Robert Menzies was striving for? David, do you have a view on that?
Well, it's interesting that most of the women who came into politics during the Menzies years and up to 1966 were on his side of politics. It's quite clear that Menzies had, in many ways, quite a radical view of what the role of women should be. And whether that has been fully implemented, I think we can say that it hasn't. It's one of the unaddressed issues that I think the Liberal Party needs to address and can be addressed. And I have no doubt in my mind it will be addressed, because we're seeing women adopt positions in society now. Particularly, I like to think since the formation of the women's sporting teams and football teams and cricket teams and so forth, and the fact that women absolutely dominate the universities, that the time is not far distant when the Liberal Party, not by setting quotas, but by following its normal recruitment procedures, will introduce more and more women into its parliamentary teams. But I think in terms of policies to affect women, I think the Liberal Party has been extraordinarily successful. And we now see, of course, the educational opportunities and the equality that's given to women, which is absolutely fundamental to Liberal ideals and Liberal philosophy.
Yes, it's interesting. Menzies would say that the fact that you are a woman or a man should not be a qualification for a position, but it shouldn't also be a disqualification for a position. So one would assume he was pretty firmly against quotas. But of course, quotas have given the other side of politics a great push in the direction of some sort of equality of representation. Whether that ends up giving you the policies that you desire or not is, I guess, a question for another day.
A general, perhaps controversial comment.
Yes,
Menzies
go for it.
That merit should be the key criterion. And the women in the Liberal Party have always exercised an independent judgment about the merit of the candidates they put forward. They have an equal say as a result of the negotiations between Menzies and Elizabeth Couchman in pre-selection conventions in Victoria and I think in many other states. And merit has been the key criterion that they have chosen to use. And I think that both disadvantages women in some respects if the best woman doesn't put herself forward at the pre-selection conventions. But from my own experience in politics, I have to say that many of the most brilliant advisors that I had were women. And I have no doubt whatever that women will make their way through these pre-selection conventions in the future in great numbers.
Well, what about the issue of inclusion of minorities, Zach? Has that met the aspirations of Robert Menzies, do you think?
I think it is something that comes up a couple of times in the book. So the chapters don't necessarily end at, say, 1949 with the first federal election victory. Often they follow through until the first state election victory, which for states like New South Wales and Tasmania can mean waiting an awful long time until the 1960s until you get to that first Liberal Party victory. And there are examples of Liberal parties in the book setting up these migrant advisory committees and trying to be a bit more open to migrant community issues. It's not necessarily been as successful as it should be, but I think that David already touched on the fact that Australian liberalism is a philosophy that's deeply tied to the immigrant experience. It comes out of the 19th century where it was the Anglo-Saxon Australians who were the immigrants, and they're coming here with these hopes and dreams and ambitions of making a better life for themselves here in Australia than they ever could have back in Europe. And at the end of the day, they succeeded, and I've always argued that that's why liberalism and conservatism are often conflated in Australia, because the Liberals were so successful that they established a liberal order that Conservatives were then trying to conserve. So those ideas and that appeal is there, but actually translating it, and particularly when you have language barriers and various other things, making sure that those ideas are articulated in a way that can really resonate with those migrant communities does remain an issue.
Indeed. This one is from Helen Brusman, OAM. I think I'll throw this to David. As we will have an election in the next 6 months, how do you think the current Liberal Party leadership will achieve their goals to win government? Well, $50 million question, I guess.
That's a big question, and the people who will be answering that will be Peter Dutton and his team. But I think that it's pretty clear that the current Federal Liberal Party is positioning itself strongly within that Menzies tradition of liberalism. When he became leader, Peter Dutton, in fact, made the point that this is not a Conservative party, it's a Liberal party. He said that quite explicitly. And I think the strongest actions that he took have been the remarkable decision on the voice referendum, where the party put itself firmly behind the equal citizenship of every citizen and opposed giving privileges to a certain group in the community, to Aboriginal Australians, on the basis of their ethnic identity or historical identity, however one wants to put it. I've no doubt at all that the economic policies are going to reflect the desire to put in place a framework of laws where enterprise is encouraged, and that is going to lead the party to confront what it hasn't perhaps confronted in the last decade, the role of workplace relations in enterprise. The Liberal Party has generally and successfully supported the independence of workplace relations, provided certain basic conditions are fulfilled. It believes, and Menzies stated this clearly, and I think John Howard also stated very clearly, that the workplace where there is a responsibility on both employers and employees to recognise their common interests and to work together to produce the best possible framework for that enterprise and the jobs it creates to be successful. Now, we're in a period where we're seeing a remarkable reversion to old-fashioned, even 1890s type approaches to industrial relations, and I see that major industries are now saying that, in fact, the burden on smaller business and larger businesses is becoming very burdensome, and that really opens the door to some very imaginative and valuable policies to encourage enterprise that are part of the party's long-term traditions.
I wonder too whether, drawing on the legacy of the Menzies era, an emphasis on home ownership is something to deeply consider. I mean, the supply side issue there is a wicked problem that governments haven't found the solution to. But Menzies, through that period 49 to 66, saw an incredible increase in home ownership. And actually here in the museum we have a graphical representation of the change from 51% renting in 47, 49% owner-occupied. By 66 you had 70% owner-occupied in Australia, which is quite a revolution. Of course, it has a huge impact on society too, on families and all the sort of social, cultural change that Australia experienced through that period.
Well, I think Australian liberalism is distinguished by its very strong support for the central social importance of the family home. And that's certainly true of Menzies, and it's been true of the party since. The federal government has limited capacity. It does have a capacity, and the most important things it controls that affect home ownership are, certainly it can influence interest rates, and it controls, of course, the laws governing access to superannuation funds. But fundamentally, the supply issue is an issue which is going to have to be dealt with by state Liberal parties. And if they're not in office, they're not going to do it. But it is a very key issue for younger Australians. And I would expect that it will begin to loom quite large in the policies of state Liberal parties as they face the next election.
Absolutely. Zach, a question here about why did Menzies never face a leadership challenge? And then why has no one been able to replicate his success? So I guess two separate questions. So the leadership challenge, he didn't have to face one?
Well, he had leadership rivals, certainly in the 1940s, specifically at this sort of era of the Unity Conference. As I touched on before, both Billy Hughes and Percy Spender, so two very prominent people, one a former Prime Minister, one a future Minister under Menzies, were not in the parliamentary UAP at the time of the Unity Conference. They had separated themselves partly because of their position on the referendum, but also because they wanted to stay involved in the National War Cabinet that Menzies and the UAP had left because they felt that the Curtin government was pursuing a partisan agenda. And then even after the 46 election defeat, there were leadership rumblings. And my understanding is that Menzies did open up the Liberal leadership to a ballot, but no one opposed him. He was re-elected unopposed. And then the bank nationalisation issue happened, and the rest is history. So it's there in the 1940s, but I think that 1949 watershed federal election victory really cemented him as the leader of the Liberal Party. And there was this certain awe that the 49ers, this huge crop of new MPs that came in 49, many of them newly returned veterans from World War II. Menzies was the only leader that they had known, and they held him with a certain reverence. And I touched on it in our podcast episode for this series, is that it's quite galling to me that Menzies felt himself so secure that he could make Harold Holt the deputy leader, that we could have a Victorian leader and then a Victorian deputy leader. He never would have thought about doing that in 1944. In 1944, it was very strategic that the New South Welshman, Eric Harrison, was the deputy. That was a necessary buy-in for New South Wales to get behind Menzies. So circumstances changed.
Is there an argument, though, David, that Menzies was also very good at managing his political opponents in terms of, sending them off to do other things or giving them portfolios that perhaps weren't very easy and cruelled their pitch, so to speak?
Well, that was often said. And I dare say some of those political opponents probably thought there might be something in that.
Yeah,
But it is a fact that political leaders are always managing their colleagues and looking at the state basis of their cabinets and the issues that are running and the capacity of people to actually defend those issues on the public platform. The attitudes of leaders to their cabinets and ministers and backbench are generally very strategic, certainly for good leaders. I've no doubt that was equally true of Howard as it was with Menzies. But Menzies also had his favourites, and they were talented favourites. Interestingly, the person for whom he campaigned for leadership after Holt's disappearance was Paul Hasluck. And he wanted Hasluck to, at one point, really to become the leader. And Hasluck, of course, being an old-time politician, said he wasn't going to campaign for the leadership. But Menzies rang around on his behalf. He didn't succeed. So the party was clearly at a moment when it was prepared to move on in some way. And I think there was a desire for the party to adopt a more sort of overtly nationalistic view, which it did with Gorton. Menzies, with his emphasis on the individual person, could see the dangers of nationalism. He was a great patriot, but not someone who wanted to promote the nation over the individual. And you can see that, of course, with his policies to encourage individuals and to limit government to setting a framework for individuals. I think that limited government is very important. He saw the danger in democracy that it could go in a totalitarian direction if power became too centralised. He would say that if governments tried to centralise power, they would end up being corrupt. And he was very proud of the fact that throughout his entire time in office, there was not the slightest hint of corruption or impropriety on the part of him or I think any of his ministers. He established a moral structure for that party which has stood it in very good stead ever since. So I'm not one to give much credit to the idea that he moved out people who might be potential leaders. I think he judged who would be leaders and he supported them.
Just in the interests of debate though, David, Harold Holt takes over from Menzies in 1966 and inherits the issue of the Voyager incident. There was definitely allegations of suspect decision-making around that. This was Australia's worst ever naval disaster and, many people lost their lives. While Menzies was now, by that stage, out of politics, there was a bit of a taint of that, and Harold Holt really suffered through his prime ministership of obviously not very long standing and was very, very stressed by that by the end, wasn't he?
Well, that was a very unfortunate and tragic incident. I don't know that Menzies was really seen as somebody who was acted improperly in that case. And indeed, I think Menzies' administration was known for its integrity and its commitment to the public interest. Whether they were right or wrong about that is another matter. But nor were the main criticisms of Holt about the incident itself, but about, as you say, suggest the management of that incident. There was the VIP incident, of course, and the management of VIP flights later on. Menzies was frankly very concerned about the quality of the leadership that Holt had given. He was quite critical of Holt in private letters to his family, and he was, I think, clearly not of the same mind as Gorton on a number of issues. Gorton was more of a nationalist, and Gorton was more of a centralist. Gorton wasn't a federalist. He wasn't a strong supporter of the autonomy of the states. So I think Menzies wasn't all that happy. But he did support Malcolm Fraser when he came along, and I think rightly so, because Fraser regarded himself
And you are a
essentially-
former chief of staff to Malcolm Fraser.
Declare an interest
Yes.
here. A former chief of staff of Malcolm Fraser. But I've written about Fraser as Menzies' disciple. And I think that's what he was. He saw himself as following on Menzies' philosophy, which put the individual at the centre of policy making.
We have quite a few questions and just 6 minutes to go, so we'll try and whip through these. Zach, I'll throw to you here. What is the significance of nationalism versus patriotism now with the challenges of social media and misinformation? And, I appreciate you're a historian, but I think there would be some quite interesting historical comparisons that we could make to the challenges of today of managing that, patriotism versus nationalism and the dangers of rampant nationalism, gone wild.
Yeah, I think certainly on that misinformation issue, I've always been keen to point out that this is not a new phenomenon. People exaggerate the extent to which misinformation didn't exist before the internet. Menzies was subject to one of the most pernicious misinformation campaigns in Australian political history, with the Brisbane Line campaign through the 1940s, this lie that he had plans to abandon Northern Australia to the Japanese, ignoring the fact that the fall of Singapore hadn't even happened when Menzies was Prime Minister. He definitely didn't necessarily think the Japanese would ever get that close. Like the historical context is all wrong with that. But I think that one of the bulwarks against sort of nationalism becoming pernicious and where patriotism is more positive is that, for me, patriotism is a more localized phenomenon. Patriotism is about your real lived experience of the nation. It's about issues like home ownership and having that stake in the nation, and what Menzies used to describe as having a sense of continuity. So you're not just in it for yourself, you actually are raising a family and care about what the nation's going to look like in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time. And the more often that politics reflects that, the better our politics will be. Whereas nationalism is about this theoretical view of the state, that you idealize the state, you see the state's success as your own success. And Menzies didn't have that. And I think one of the best defenses against that pernicious nationalism is federalism itself, is this idea that we have dual loyalties. We are Australians and New South Welshmen or whatever it may be. And in Menzies' day, he would add a citizen of the Commonwealth to that these things can overlap. And he emphasised that with his Scottish heritage as well. It's when your identity, whatever variety of identity it may be, becomes the be-all and end-all rather than viewing people as individuals that things go awry.
I guess
there's another concept which is important.
With 3 minutes to go and one more question. Right. Sorry.
I'll respect that. National sovereignty shouldn't be overlooked, because national sovereignty is the bedrock of democracy. Because without national sovereignty, you can't define who the people are to whom the government is accountable. Menzies was very strong in defending national sovereignty. So was Howard. And I think that's a big issue for the future of liberalism. A sort of naive internationalism is actually anti-democratic. And I think that that's a part of the liberal tradition.
So this question perhaps, I think, dovetails pretty nicely into that. Is the modern Liberal Party too influenced by global politics of the right? And this question is thinking of Donald Trump, of the Conservative Party in the UK.
I would say absolutely not. I think both those countries are very different. I have noticed that there is a tendency to bring both American and British language into Australian politics, because there's no doubt that there is an international world and culture which influences Australia a great deal, and Australian liberalism has always been influenced by that international culture. But having said that, I think the Australian liberalism is a unique product. It's grown in Australia. It reflects both the importance of institutions to individuals and the priority of individuals and their rights and responsibilities and duties. And I think that that is what distinguishes Australian liberalism from other political creeds in other countries.
Very nicely done, David. Right on the knocker. That is the end of our first Afternoon Light Live. Thank you so much to David Kemp and to Zach Gorman. Of course, I do need to encourage you to go onto our website and purchase this book, Unity and Autonomy. We'll make sure it gets to you as soon as possible. And a quick spruik for launches of the book. In-person launches. On the 6th of November in Canberra at Old Parliament House, Angus Taylor will be launching the book there. On the 28th of November in Sydney, the Sydney Institute is very kindly hosting a launch of Unity and Autonomy there with John Howard and John Anderson. And then finally here in Melbourne on the 3rd of December, right here in the Old Quadrangle, Josh Frydenberg will be launching Unity and Autonomy. Thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.